Okay, welcome to the deep dive. So today we're tackling a really interesting challenge, something I suspect a lot of you, those of you who've reached a C1 level in English can probably relate to. It's that frustrating gap between understanding English really well and actually speaking it easily. We're going to dive into this whole idea of overthinking. Why is it that even when you've got the grammar, you've got the vocabulary,
Yeah.
spontaneous speaking can still feel like walking through a mental minefield?
Exactly. And you've likely put in so much time, so much effort to get here, right? To this advanced stage. You've mastered complex stuff, loads of vocab. But then when it comes to just speaking freely, there's this internal voice, this constant analysis. It just seems to trip you up. It's a very specific challenge at this C1 level.
It really is. You might be fantastic at writing, crafting these perfect emails, acing tests. But when it comes to just talking, it's like your brain's running this constant real-time spell check, grammar check, everything check, and it slows you right down. So our mission today really is to unpack why this overthinking happens, especially for C1 learners, and more importantly, give you some actionable strategies, tools to move past that mental gridlock and just speak with the confidence your English level actually deserves. We're drawing on insights from a C1 learner's guide for this.
Okay, so let's start by really dissecting this overthinking trap, because it does hit C1 learners differently. This isn't like, a beginner struggling with basic sentence structure.
Yeah.
At C1, you have this huge linguistic toolkit. And actually, maybe ironically, sometimes having all those options, that can be part of the issue.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that. How does this overthinking actually show up when someone at C1 is trying to speak? What does it sound like, feel like?
Well, the guide points out a few key ways. One big one is what it calls grammar paralysis. So, multiple ways to say something, right? Different grammar structures, maybe subtle meaning differences. But instead of just picking one and going with it, you start mentally cycling through them all. Which one's perfect for this exact moment? And that internal debate, well, that's where the pauses and hesitations come from.
Oh, I recognize that. Even in my native language sometimes, that urge to get it exactly right.
Yeah.
And in that split second, you're thinking the flow is just gone. What else? What other forms does it take?
Another really common one is vocabulary vetting. You've got a great vocabulary, but you start second-guessing yourself. Is this the best word? Is there a smarter synonym I should use? Is this too formal, too informal? This constant search for the quote-unquote perfect word, it delays you. It kills the spontaneity. It's not that you lack words, it's that you're overthinking the choosing part.
Right, so it's not struggling to find a word, it's being almost overwhelmed by having too many words to choose from.
Wow.
I bet pronunciation anxiety is a big one here too.
Absolutely. Once you get to C1, you're often much more aware of those little pronunciation details, the nuances, and that can make you more self-conscious about your accent or about potentially mispronouncing something, so you might hesitate before certain words, or even, actively avoid words you're not 100% sure how to say perfectly, and that obviously limits how naturally you can express yourself.
It's like you're judging your own speech against this super high, almost native speaker standard, but doing it live as you speak.
Yeah.
And the fear of judgment.
That's
just pour fuel on the fire.
It really does. You've worked so hard to get to this advanced level, right? So there can be this bigger fear of being judged negatively by native speakers, maybe even by other learners. Any little mistake feels bigger. The internal pressure can be huge. This feeling that, oh, I'm C1 now, I shouldn't be making these kinds of errors. It just feeds the whole overthinking cycle.
Creates so much pressure. And then finally, the guide mentions the perfect sentence syndrome. That sounds exhausting.
It is. It's this underlying belief, often subconscious, that every single thing you say has to be grammatically perfect, beautifully structured, eloquently put. But the guide rightly points out, that's just not how real conversation works, not even for native speakers. We stumble, we self-correct, we use sentence fragments. Striding for that impossible ideal is a massive driver of overthinking.
So you've got all these things potentially happening at once. Checking grammar, vetting vocab, worrying about pronunciation, fear of being judged, chasing perfect sentences.
Yeah.
Wow. No wonder it feels so mentally taxing. And the guide mentions this can become a vicious cycle, right?
Yes, and this is really key. The more you overthink, the more you hesitate, the less fluent you sound. And then your inner critic takes that hesitation as proof. Say, you need to overthink more carefully to avoid mistakes. It's this awful negative feedback loop. The trying to be perfect actually makes you less fluent, which then reinforces the perceived need to be perfect.
Yeah, the guide gives that really vivid example of Mei Ling from Taiwan studying in London. Brilliant academic writer, right? But in casual chats, she'd just freeze. Her mind was doing everything at once, translating, checking grammar, worrying about pronunciation. By the time she'd mentally built the perfect sentence, the conversation had moved 5 steps ahead. She described it as having a fluent inner voice, but a stuck outer voice. I bet so many listeners recognize that exact feeling.
It's a perfect illustration, isn't it? The very analytical skills that helped her reach C1 were suddenly blocking her spoken fluency. So, okay, we've got a clear picture now of how overthinking shows up for C1 learners. Let's dig into the psychology, the why. What's going on underneath?
Exactly. Because understanding the roots, that's often the best first step to finding solutions. The guy talks about the safety net illusion. What's that about?
Well, our brains are wired for self-protection, right? And when you're speaking a non-native language, making a mistake can feel surprisingly threatening, like a threat to your competence, maybe even your identity as this good language learner. So overthinking becomes this kind of illusory safety net. Your subconscious thinks, if I just check everything meticulously, I can avoid any mistakes and avoid feeling bad or vulnerable. But of course, we know mistakes are totally normal, essential even for learning. And this safety net doesn't really work. It just restricts you.
That makes so much sense. Your brain trying to prevent a little stumble, even though the consequences of stumbling are usually tiny. And perfectionism. That plays a big role too, doesn't it? Maybe even more so at C1, when you feel closer to that native-like ideal.
Oh, absolutely. Think about how many educational systems really hammer error correction. It can drill into us this deep desire for flawless performance. For advanced learners, this can mean that any little slip feels like a major failure, which just fuels more overthinking. At C1, you're aware of more subtle errors, which kind of paradoxically can make you scrutinize your speech even more.
Yeah, it's like we're trained to see mistakes as failures to avoid, not as, data points for learning. And then there's the straightforward fear of failure or criticism. That feels pretty universal.
It is. Speaking a language that's not your first always involves some vulnerability. You're putting yourself out there. And it's natural to worry a bit about how people perceive your English. But that fear can lead to excessive self-monitoring, being afraid to take risks with language, which again leads straight back to overthinking and hesitation. And the perceived stakes feel higher at C1.
Like being on a stage, and the spotlight feels extra bright because you're performing in your second language. And speaking of mental effort, the guide brings up cognitive load. How does that fit in?
Right. So just speaking in a second language is already demanding mentally. Your brain's juggling, listening, finding words, applying grammar, physically speaking. Overthinking adds another whole layer on top of that. It's like thinking about thinking, constantly evaluating your own output. This extra burden can just overload your working memory. Makes you tired, slows you down. It's like running too many heavy programs on your computer at once.
That's a great analogy, like trying to edit the video while you're still recording it. And finally, the guide highlights something really crucial and maybe more internal: lack of self-compassion.
Yes. We are often so much harder on ourselves in language learning than we'd ever be on a friend. When you make a mistake in English, that inner critic can be brutal. It magnifies the negative thoughts, ramps up anxiety about the next time you have to speak. This lack of kindness toward yourself just creates fertile ground for overthinking and really undermines your confidence.
That inner critic can be so loud. Okay, so we've looked at the what and the why of overthinking for C1 learners. Now, the really important bit: how to move from analysis paralysis to action. The guide has some really practical strategies. Where should we start?
Well, really fundamental shift is to consciously embrace the good enough principle. In a real, flowing conversation, aiming for absolute perfection is usually just counterproductive. Native speakers make mistakes all the time. Little grammar slips, awkward phrases, they correct themselves, but they still communicate effectively. Your main goal should be clear communication, getting your message across understandably, not delivering flawless sentences every single time.
Okay, so the practical takeaway there is aim for intelligibility. Don't get stuck searching for the absolute perfect word or the most complex structure. Often, the first decent option that pops into your head is actually the best choice for keeping the conversation moving.
Exactly, and a really good technique to help with this is to try practicing speaking just a little bit faster than feels totally comfortable, even if it means you make a few more small errors at first. Pushing the speed forces your brain to prioritize flow over constant microcorrections.
Right. The guide mentions Lena from Germany.
Yeah.
Her English was grammatically great, but very slow, very deliberate. Her tutor told her to just speak nonstop for 30 seconds about anything, even nonsense. She said it felt weird, but the world didn't end. Her speed picked up, and she literally didn't have time to overthink every word.
It's about retraining your brain, isn't it? Prioritizing momentum. Okay, next strategy. Consciously shift your focus. Move it away from your output, your own words, and onto the input, really listening to the other person. Overthinkers often get so wrapped up in their own internal monologue, their self-assessment, that they actually miss important parts of what the other person is saying.
So the application is active listening. When you feel that overthinking starting up, deliberately pull your attention back to the speaker. Ask questions, maybe quickly summarize what they said in your head to check it, you understood. Engage with their ideas instead of just focusing or crafting your perfect reply.
Mm-hmm. And a simple tip is to try mentally summarizing their last point before you respond. Forces you to process it. Like Javier from Mexico, living in Ireland. He realized he was so busy building his own sentences, he was zoning out of the actual conversation. Focusing on listening made his replies much more natural, less forced.
That makes total sense. Takes the pressure off your own speaking when you're genuinely focused on understanding them.
Yeah.
Okay, what's another strategy? This one sounds interesting.
Yeah, this next one can feel a bit strange at first, but it's powerful. Setting a mistake quota. Basically, you proactively challenge that fear of errors. Set yourself a goal. In this conversation, I'm going to aim to make, say, 3 noticeable mistakes. It reframes mistakes completely. They're not failures. They're targets. They're normal, expected parts of learning.
Wow, okay, so you go into it thinking, right, task for today, make 3 mistakes. That actually sounds weirdly freeing.
It can be incredibly liberating. And when you do make one, just notice it, maybe even laugh about it lightly if the situation allows, and crucially, move on. It helps desensitize you. And keeping a mistake journal, just jotting down maybe one interesting mistake you noticed each day, can shift your view from, oh no, I messed up, to, that's interesting data. Sumita from India found this really boosted her confidence, made her much bolder in speaking.
I love that idea of a mistake journal. Turning errors into objective data is not something to beat yourself up about. Okay, next technique.
The no pause rule. But, and this is important, just for short, specific practice boosts, the idea is to break that habit of always thinking everything through before you say anything. For these short, timed periods, you just speak continuously. No pausing to correct, no pausing to think too much.
Okay, so practically you'd start small. Like set a timer for 15, maybe 20 seconds and just talk about anything.
Yeah.
What you see, what you did this morning. The goal isn't perfection, it's just keeping the words flowing. Then maybe gradually make the intervals longer.
Precisely. Use a timer. It helps. Marco from Italy, he felt really blocked sometimes. He started doing these little rant sessions in English to his reflection, just talking nonstop. Even if he repeated himself or the grammar wasn't perfect, he found it helped bypass that internal editor. Just get the words out.
That sounds like a really practical way to just grease the wheels, bypass the gatekeepers. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. More internal focus now. Mindfulness and self-compassion.
Yes. As we touched on, overthinking often comes from not being fully present and being too hard on yourself. Mindfulness helps you notice your thoughts without getting swept away by them. Self-compassion is about treating yourself with kindness, especially when you stumble.
So practically speaking, this means trying to notice when you're falling into that overthinking loop during a conversation. Like, oh, okay, there I go, worrying about verb tenses again. Acknowledge it, but don't judge yourself for it. And then gently bring your focus back to the conversation. And the self-compassion part is about actively challenging that negative self-talk, replacing, that sounds stupid, with something more like, okay, that wasn't perfect, but I got my point across.
Exactly. And a really simple but effective micro habit. Take one deep, conscious breath before you start speaking in a situation that makes you nervous. It just grounds you for a second. Reduces that initial anxiety spike. Akiko from Japan found that learning to just notice and release those overthinking moments using mindfulness made a huge difference to her relaxation and confidence.
Just creating that tiny bit of mental space. Makes sense. Okay, and the final big strategy the guide highlights is chunking and automatization through practice. Sounds a bit technical, but the idea is moving beyond single words.
That's exactly it. A lot of natural, fluent speech isn't built word by word on the fly. Native speakers rely heavily on pre-made chunks. These are common phrases, collocations words that just naturally go together, idiomatic expressions. Overthinking happens when you're trying to construct every sentence from absolute scratch. Automatization is about making these common chunks readily available, almost subconscious, so you can use them without thinking too hard.
Okay, so practical things here would be like revisiting shadowing, but really focusing on the rhythm, the intonation, the common phrases, not just repeating words, and maybe sentence mining. Pulling out useful chunks and collocations from things you read or listen to and actively practicing using them yourself. drilling common fillers and transition words until they just roll off the tongue.
Yes, all of those. And a really key tip is focusing specifically on learning and using collocations. Knowing which words typically partner up makes your speech sound way more natural, and it cuts down on that agonizing search for the right individual word. Carlos from Colombia started keeping a notebook just for these chunks and phrases. He'd practice using them in different ways, and eventually they became much more automatic, like having ready-made building blocks.
These are all super practical. Great. Now, the guide also looks at some specific common scenarios where C1 learners tend to get stuck overthinking and gives quick solutions. Let's run through a few.
Sure. Scenario 1. You know several synonyms like happy, joyful, elated, and you freeze trying to pick the absolute best one, the solution. Just go with the first appropriate one that comes to mind, honestly. In conversation, flow usually trumps finding the most nuanced synonym imaginable.
Right. Don't let your great vocabulary actually slow you down.
Oh.
Okay, scenario 2. Worrying too much about your accent.
Yeah, getting hung up on specific sounds or intonation. The advice here is prioritize being understood intelligibility over having a perfect accent. Most native speakers encounter tons of accents. Focus on clear sounds. If you want to refine your accent, great, do that in separate practice, but don't let it paralyze you in real conversations.
Good advice. Scenario 3. You make a small grammar mistake while speaking.
And the overthinking brain goes, oh no, wrong tense. They think I'm terrible. The solution, usually, just let it go. Seriously. Unless it really blocks understanding. Native speakers slip up all the time. If you do correct yourself, make it quick and smooth. Oh, he goes there, sorry, and keep talking. Don't dwell on it. Don't let it derail you.
Absolutely. The energy spent agonizing over a tiny slip is way worse than the slip itself. Okay, scenario 4. Trying to remember a really specific, maybe complex word or idiom.
You know it's right there, on the tip of your tongue, but you can't grab it. Solution. Simplify. Forget the fancy word. Just explain the concept using simpler terms. The goal is communication, not showing off rare vocabulary. Often, the simpler way is clearer anyway.
Totally. Better to be clear than to stumble trying to sound impressive. And final scenario. Feeling anxious about being misunderstood.
Yeah, this can lead to massive over-explaining, hedging everything. The solution here is trust your C1 level. You can express complex ideas, state your point clearly, confidently. Then see how the listener reacts. If they look confused, then clarify. Don't preemptively explain every single detail just in case.
Trust your skills. That's a recurring theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
The guide also shares some really inspiring stories, doesn't it? Learners who actually beat this overthinking thing. Can you share one or two? Show it's possible.
Definitely. There's Chen from China doing his PhD in the UK. Huge pressure for academic presentations, right? Knew his stuff inside out, but got so tangled up trying to make every sentence perfect, his delivery was really stiff. His supervisor gave him some wild advice. Try intentionally leaving out a few articles sometimes, just to disrupt the perfectionism. It felt wrong to him at first, but it worked. It helped him trust his knowledge, trust he could recover from tiny imperfections, made his talks much more engaging.
Wow. Deliberately making small mistakes to break the cycle. That's brilliant. What's another one?
There's Isabella from Italy, working in marketing in the US. She used to dread networking events. She'd plan exactly what she was going to say, potential questions, the whole script in her head. And of course, when she finally spoke, it felt forced, or the moment had passed. Her breakthrough came when someone told her, just focus on saying hello, that's it, engage immediately. Genuinely. She stopped planning the whole conversation and just focused on the first few words, then really listening. Made a huge difference. Much more fluid, much more natural.
Amazing. Just focusing on the initial connection, not the whole performance. It really shows how that mental pre-planning can actually stop you from being present.
Exactly. And the guide wraps up with very concrete ways to weave these solutions into your daily routine. Things like a quick morning warm-up with that no-pause speaking, making active listening a conscious goal in conversations, keeping that mistake journal, doing purposeful shadowing, actively seeking out casual chats, joining conversation clubs, setting tiny specific goals around fluency, not just accuracy.
Those all sound really doable. Things you, the listener, can actually start trying out today or this week. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway? The ultimate message for that C1 learner who's wrestling with overthinking?
I think the guide puts it really well. Getting to C1 is huge. You know the language. The block now is often more psychological than linguistic. Overthinking is basically habit, a mental pattern. And like any habit, you can unlearn it with awareness, with practice, real fluency. It isn't about never making mistakes. It's about freeing yourself from that inner critic, finding the courage to speak anyway, seeing mistakes as just part of the process, being flexible, and ultimately just connecting with people.
So it really boils down to shifting focus, doesn't it? Away from constant internal analysis, away from chasing some impossible ideal of perfection, and towards just doing it. Engaging, accepting the imperfections, trusting your gut, your intuition, and prioritizing getting your message across. Your English skills are already there at a high level. It's about letting them flow without that constant mental braking system.
Precisely. Trust that C1 knowledge you worked so hard for. Give your brain permission to use it spontaneously without needing every word signed off in triplicate first. Embrace the messy reality of real talk. It's where the real learning happens now.
That's a really encouraging place to end. Okay, so for you, our listener, here's something to mull over this week. Think about one specific way overthinking shows up for you. Maybe it is the vocabulary vetting. Maybe it's grammar paralysis. Pick one. Then choose just one strategy we talked about today and consciously try applying it this week in your English conversations. Just notice what happens. What happens when you deliberately choose flow over flawless execution? Just for a bit. We'd love for you to explore that. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.